Welcome you here at this conference, Crises and Victims, organized by Polányi Center, by Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, by Eszmélet, journal Eszmélet, and yesterday's field screening was supported by Goethe Institute Hungary. It's really a great pleasure to welcome you, and just to start immediately, I ask first Piotr Janiszewski to come out. He's going to address you on behalf of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and then immediately afterwards Professor Iván Szelényi is going to open today's workshop. And Iván Szelényi is a Prem Sumner Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Yale University. Thank you very much, Piotr.
Thank you, Attila. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, on behalf of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and on behalf of the head of the Central East European Office of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Iván, who was unfortunately not able to come to Budapest due to health issues, I would like to welcome you to our event. I think it is quite obvious why we believe that the topic is very hot, and it is very important to discuss it. It is the main topic of European policy discussions all over for many, many months. And as well, I think it is quite obvious why Budapest, because this is this refugee crisis is especially important, and especially reshaping the policy discourses in Central and East Europe, in the Balkans, and this is very important to talk about it here in Budapest. Why I think especially this kind of event is relevant to the current Hungarian and European professional discussions on the refugee issues is because it will hopefully, I'm convinced it will, present a more critical and an original view of the crisis. Will present it not only as a crisis of European and governmental institutions and a crisis of European asylum seeking policy, but also as a crisis of social policy and a crisis of political will and determination to resolve the crisis with respect to common human values and human rights. I would like to thank colleagues from Eszmélet and Polányi Center for cooperating this event, especially since they were the ones burdened with most of the organizational work. I am very happy that we were able to gather great panels with renowned experts from, especially from our part of Europe, from the Central East and the Balkan states, and I wish you fruitful discussions and a very building debate.
Thank you very much. I have to go there. Thank you very much. It is a great honor to chair this introductory session. Attila wanted to persuade me to give a keynote address. And I vehemently refused because I said migration is a field of scholarship and it is not my field of scholarship. Well, I lived for 5 years in Abu Dhabi. I was Dean of Social Sciences at NYU Abu Dhabi. So I lived in an Islamic country and actually did carry out a little research on guest workers who returned from the United Arab Emirates to Pakistan. So I dirtied my fingers a little with the problem. But then I understood what a wonderful, exciting and rich field migration is, and I realized that this is not really my field. But it's a pleasure to be chair of this meeting. And in this session we will have 3 papers The first one is by József Böröcz, who is a professor of sociology at Rutgers University, and his paper is about materialist background to the 2015 refugee crisis in Europe. I think József is a bit optimistic to limit this crisis to 2015. I hope he will be right. The next presentation will be by Prem Kumar Rajaram, who is an associate professor at Central European University, and his paper is Common Marginalization, Governing Migrants and Subaltern Populations. And third paper will be by Susan Zimmerman, who is a professor at Central European University. It's on gender, anti-feminism, imperialism, the current refugee crisis, quote unquote, through the lens of history. As I said, I was unable to accept this generous invitation to give a keynote address, but I thought I'd just make a couple of comments about this crisis the world, and in particular Europe is facing currently. And there is nothing particularly deep or new what I got to say, but it's quite obvious that this crisis has little to do by people moving to Europe, and certainly I think it's quite obvious to me and probably to many people in this room that the way how to deal with this crisis is not to build walls. The roots of the crisis are obviously the wars which were initiated by the United States and by NATO. There are 60 million people who are refugees today around the world, and there are over 4 million people who have to escape their countries, driven by wars. It's particularly sad that those countries which were primarily responsible for this crisis are not really ready to pay the prices of this crisis. The United States so far admitted 1,800 Syrian refugees. And even the Obama administration, an administration otherwise I admire a great deal, is dragging his feet to give the visa to translators who were working for the American army in Afghanistan and whose life is in permanent danger. And of course, in Europe, next to the Visegrad 4, it is particularly England and France who were very much in rush to throw bombs in these countries, who are the most reluctant to accept these countries. So I just have to express my admiration to Angela Merkel and the Swedes, who had the least to do with the causes of this crisis, to try to do something about it. Of course, nobody is pleased that this is happening the way as it is happening. It's a bit difficult to understand why the US, the UN, and the NATO was not prepared for this. Many of those people who arrive now in Europe have been living in very miserable refugee camps in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Did not have work permits there, lived on handouts in miserable condition. And if they looked around, they saw what happened to the Palestinians, and they saw what their future will be if they stay the way as they are. There are all kinds of conspiracy theory who organized, right, this movement of people to Europe. For me, that's, of course, not a mystery. Who did it? The smugglers, who made a multi-billion-dollar business out of it, bringing them into Europe, people who were desperate. And they actually were bringing people in here who were, especially from Syria, quite educated, and better to do because they were the only people who could pay those bribes, which was necessary to go into Europe. We don't know exactly the composition, right, of the refugees. I have seen data from Germany and Sweden among the Syrian refugees. 21% has actual university education, and 20% has high school education. It's a highly educated a group of people. Those who stay beyond in the refugee camps are probably less well-to-do and less well-educated. Now let me say here a word about the issue which has been discussed a great deal, and much to my dismay, even in my favorite newspaper, in the New York Times, the question was posed the wrong day. I keep reading in the New York Times that what we see here is a clash of civilization. I have to confess, you know, I tend to be politically incorrect, and the Huntington book impressed me as a very interesting book, especially after Fukuyama, who really got a wrong diagnosis in his 1989 article as the end of history, and now the whole world will become a liberal democracy. I think Huntington realized that the end of contestation between socialism and market capitalism does not mean the end of conflicts. And I think he had a point that there are new dividing lines around civilizations. He, of course, badly misunderstood and underestimated the abilities of all civilization to be able to adapt to modernity and to market capitalism. Of course, Confucianism created one of the great economic miracles, right, of the world. And now those of us Bulgarians who have read Weber and told us Confucianism will never gel with capitalism, now with great embarrassment have to concede that in fact Confucianism works better with capitalism than the Judeo-Christian civilization. Well, Islam is a complicated story, I have to concede. But having lived in Abu Dhabi, was astonished how well, actually, Islam works with capitalism. It violates all rules in social history. Right? Friday and Saturday are the days when banks are closed. Sunday they are open. So there are 3 days in the week when it's impossible to make any monetary transaction from the United Arab Emirates. Somehow doesn't hurt them at all. It works fine. When Eid comes, on the day of Eid, that's the day after Ramadan, when people were not starving for a month. Finally they eat, so that's the big holiday. But Eid, we don't know when it comes. It comes when the dedicated person sees the moon. Can capitalism work this way? Yes, it can. It can work fine. Well, just one very last comment about integration. One received wisdom in the current discourses. Of course, this is a kind of population, Muslims, which will never be able to integrate in Western societies. That's, of course, wrong. We know we have a lot of evidence that Muslims do very well in Western societies. So yes, many of them will keep their religion. Indeed, to put it this way, the ethnogenicity of Muslims, the word is bad because, of course, not ethnicity, it's a religion, is strong. But they, of course, can be integrated. And then, you read the story about Polányi, and here you read, even in New York Times, this is the clash of civilization. My goodness gracious, since when we teach Islam that New Year's Eve you have to get drunk, and in public places, right, you have to do sexual acts? I mean, nothing is further away from Islam than what happened on Cologne before the railway station. What was it? Well, Durkheim had the right term for it. It was anomie. It was exactly the problem of a population group which comes from a strictly controlled culture, enters Western culture, but it looks like anything can be done. And then, of course, the public opinion jumps on it, the media jumps on it, and especially the right-wing party jumped on it and said, here is the solid evidence that all these refugees are criminal, just like Donald Trump said, right? All these Latinos, right, are murderers and rapists. Well, as far as I know, after police investigation, they accused 3 refugees in Cologne being involved in these troubles. They also accused 3 German-speaking ethnic Germans to do the same. Anyway, the point is, I think the discourse around the current crisis is excessively cast in Islamophobic ways rather than a better understanding of the situation. And I'm grateful for the organizers of this conference, of this session, to give us scholarly insights into this, what I would not be able to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, as the first regular panelist, I would like to very sincerely thank the organizers of this very important conference, specifically Attila and his crew for doing this, as well as the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, Eszmélet and the Polányi Institute at Corvinus University for their sponsorship of this event in their unique ways. My presentation has a somewhat provocative title, and I will start my talk by trying to explain why I chose this approach. In early 2015, the government of Hungary reacted to a slip in its popularity by importing a set of well-worn rhetorics, initially only, quote-unquote, anti-immigrant jingoism from the repertoire of the Republican Party of the United States. To be more precise, the extreme right wing of the Republican Party, referred to as the Tea Party. There is, by the way, an immediate personal connection between the Tea Party and the Hungarian government. They share a key advisor. In a few months, with the sudden opening of the second access route for the influx of asylum seekers to the Balkans, the same government took a leading role in staging a full-scale and, in Eastern Europe, unprecedented political campaign that was, by that time, not just anti-immigrant, but also anti-refugee, much more specific rhetoric, plus anti-human rights, and detectably racist, settling on a textbook illustration to the concept of cultural racism. By this time, the narrative, the government's narrative, was also coupled by a series of self-contradictory and confused European Union-level policy suggestions, as well as local national policing measures involving a number of, again, self-contradictory acts, and finally settling on the construction of fences on the southern border, various sections of the southern border of the country. Now, criticisms of this series of acts on part of the government came quite quickly from three specific perspectives. There was one, an insistence on the application of a set of legal principles against which the government's actions would not hold. The second were condemnations of these narratives, policy approaches, and unilateral actions on political grounds. And third, some other people were foregrounding a set of moral values, all of which purport to point at a different, more accepting, more tolerant, and more open-minded approach. Now, all three of those criticisms are very well taken, and I think all social scientists, all political activists, and or at least those who are not on the right, and generally all people with good conscience should support them. However, it is also noticeable that all three of those criticisms start out of and remain steadfastly within a framework that avoids what could be referred to as the material basis of social existence in this part of the world. By the way, in that regard, they are not that different from the government's original rhetoric, which also avoids references to the material basis of the existence of societies in this part of the world. Today, I aim to provide a set of relatively small windows through which we can take a peek at the background that is behind all this. So what I offer is a sort of critique of the criticisms in a very friendly and supporting, but at the same time sharply critical way. I'm not offering an exhaustive list of material background information. It is really just a set of illustrations. So the first one is something I'm going to call global positions. The states whose citizens have recently become displaced persons in very large refugee camps in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, and who have even more recently appeared in the Schengen area with their asylum requests, are not failed states. They were destroyed, and that destruction was largely exogenous, that is, it came from the outside. that exogenous destruction of these of those states involved the sequential combination of two steps of foreign intervention. First, what the United States political establishment refers to as regime change, followed very closely, second, by open military conflict, specifically civil war or war, external war. This combination between externally induced regime change followed by war is actually something that has been with us for the last 2.5 decades, essentially from the weakening, the point at which the Soviet bloc began to show serious signs of weakening. These states have a number of features in common. Other than Yugoslavia, which was the first where this approach was tried, they are not only multi-ethnic and multi-denominational, which is of course true for Yugoslavia also, but also predominantly Muslim societies, authoritarian nationalist states that were decidedly non-Islamic. All of them, by the way, had participated quite actively in the Bandung Agreement, that is the agreement among non-aligned states in the world, including Yugoslavia, of course. Since the colonial times, the states, other than Yugoslavia, have played important roles in the supply of hydrocarbon energy, especially oil, to the world market. More to the point, they are located in an area which is wedged, as it were, between the West, so to speak, and the more Islamic, more decidedly, more committedly, religiously Islamic states of the Arab Peninsula and Central Asia, in a spatial location whose geopolitical character is accurately described by former German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer in his somewhat cryptic but also quite apt geopolitical vision about the necessary, and I quote, finality of EU enlargement. But what he meant by that is that there needs to be a conversation as to where the eastward expansion of the European Union will stop. This happens to be that part of the world where it is exactly the question where the European Union's expansion is going to stop. One of the states that is receiving a huge number of refugees is actually a state that is actively seeking membership in the European Union, has been for multiple decades, Turkey. Now, I propose to offer yet another objective materialist view of these locations. This requires a basic tool. I don't know if this is visible or not. This is just a simple two-dimensional representation of the world's states. The vertical dimension is how rich they are. Basically, their per capita GDP expressed as percentage of the world average at the time. So, sort of in the middle, if you were to draw a horizontal line, those would be the states that have 100% on the world average in terms of their income. Those above are richer, those below are poorer. I actually plotted 3 time points here. So it's the world multiplied by 3. 1990, 2000, and 2008. The horizontal dimension is a more geopolitical representation of the same thing, which is basically the share of each national economy in the world market. So to the extent that you're further to the right, you are bigger, therefore you exert a greater influence on the world geopolitically. If you're to the left, that means you're smaller and less powerful. Now, here's I'm with those lines. The lines represent, the thicker ones are basically the medians of the world distribution. So basically, since I'm doing multiple time points, it's not a single line, but sort of a band there. So that means, if I may remind you, a median is a line where 50% of the cases fall above and 50% of them fall below. Whereas the other, the narrower band is not means, the arithmetic means. So they just indicate the area, that little square, not square, but rectangular area in the middle sort of indicates the really smack at the middle of the world's distribution. Those would be the states that have relatively median kind of levels of power and relatively median levels of income. Okay? And so if you plot the states that I just mentioned, Yugoslavia I mentioned already, and Iraq at various time points, and Syria, as well as Libya, then that's how it would look. I also put Afghanistan in there. However, Afghanistan is so poor and so tiny that it doesn't fit the scale, because it would sort of fall below the left bottom corner, right? So it doesn't show. Now, this seems to indicate that there is something really irregular going on. There's this business of regime change plus wars seems to have happened to states that are kind of sort of in the middle, predominantly, of the world's distribution in these two relatively important regards. Libya is a different story, but the others sort of seem to cluster. Now, that's an interesting conversation in and of itself, because there are quite powerful theories in the world which seem to suggest that where you are in these distributions actually has an impact on what functions your state performs for the world economy. Not to mention that there are other theories, as part of the same theories, which also argue that there would, therefore, because of your shared location, there would be vaguely similar class structures, vaguely similar state capacities, vaguely similar gender and other processes going on. Not exactly identical, of course, but sort of similar. For instance, what that means, what being in the middle of the world distribution means, is that you can actually have a fairly powerful educated group who actually are educated in the Western way. Now, much more important from the perspective of my talk is the next graph, which includes the societies of the world that were state socialist until 1989. If you look at those brown sort of crooked lines there, those are basically the currently European Union member states of what used to be the Soviet bloc. It is absolutely clear that, that they, so to speak, basically surround these societies. Of course, one of them, Yugoslavia itself, is a former socialist state, and the others are sort of there. Now, as a basic insight that I derive from that, we can sort of conclude that, therefore, they're not that different from the societies of this part of the world. Kind of different, but not really. Especially if we consider not just the northern tier of the former socialist bloc, but also the Balkan states, as well as the, which I did not put in this graph, the successor states of the Soviet Union, many of which would actually be sort of closer to where Iraq 90 is, right? So in that part, and closer also to Libya, which is in the segment. Now, when members of these societies show up on the borders of Schengen land as potential asylum seekers, what the not particularly cosmopolitan governments, political and intellectual elites, and vast lower middle classes of these societies see, beyond the obvious rhetoric of biological and cultural racism, is potential competitors in the broadest sense of the word, both in their own societies as well as in the markets in Western Europe, which is going to be my next point. Now, the next question, therefore, that needs to be addressed is what exactly is the European Union that these people are trying to move into, and whose eastern sort of flanks, the East European member states of the EU, have reacted so vehemently against them. Of course, the EU is a great many things. It really depends on your perspective and the purposes of your analysis, what you end up concluding on. For my purposes, the most sort of important thing to consider is that the European Union began in the 1950s as a relatively wealthy club of former colonial powers. Then it became a relatively wealthy club of West European powers when it started to admit West European states that had no meddling in the colonial process. And then with the 2004 expansion, the entire landscape of the European Union changed radically. What happened is not just that these new member states, and there are quite a few of them, as you know, are not former colonial powers. In fact, they had relatively little to do with colonialism whatsoever, other than enjoying sort of indirectly some of the benefits of whiteness that comes with it, nothing like that. But also they are mid-level income states. Now, when you construct a system of economic integration between amongst sets of states, one set of which is extremely poor, I mean, there are extremely rich, major outliers in the world distribution, so they occupy the top positions of all states in the world. Whereas another group is sort of middle income, there's this gap in between. It doesn't take much of an economic, sort of political economy genius to expect that what is going to happen is new disparities, and on the basis of that, new dependencies will emerge. And my intention is that that's exactly what has happened. What I mean by dependency in overall is a fairly simple definition. In this regard, I differ from a huge literature on dependency because I find their arguments relatively complicated for my purposes. So I'm just going to say that for this argument, dependency is basically a network connection, which is at least between two nodes, two actors, in this case two states, where that connection is very considerably more important for one actor than the other. Okay? So dependency is an objective condition in which there is a tie between two actors, where that existence of that tie is much more important for one actor than the other. That's all I mean by dependency here. The first mechanism of that that I would also, the European Union as we know it today has a number of such arrangements, for instance technological dependency, financial dependency and so on, which I'm not going to address. What I will talk about, however, a little bit about is foreign direct investment. The reason I mention this is because this was the fastest sort of mechanism that's setting in the early 90s in East Central Europe. Now, of course, FDI, foreign direct investment, is an increasingly dominant feature of the world economy, and in other words, the amount of foreign direct investment is increasing. There are basically three more or less rough positions that states can occupy with respect to that. There are some states which specialize in exporting capital. These tend to be the richest, most powerful worlds in the world. What that means in specific terms is that the capital-owning classes of those societies can derive significant amounts of profit from the labor of people who are not only not citizens of their states, but they're not even physically in the confines of those states. In other words, they live abroad. The second such situation that can happen is that a state can be more or less sort of close to an equal balance in terms of foreign direct investment. In other words, it receives a huge amount or a medium amount, and it also exports a huge amount or a medium amount. And then there is a third situation in which you have very considerably greater import of capital than you're able to export capital. That situation involves, just to go back to the basic political economy here, a situation in which your own citizens produce profits for capital that is located outside. Okay? Now, the actual data seem to indicate that the European Union's West European member states are of the second kind that I just mentioned. In other words, they have fairly significant amounts of incoming as well as outgoing foreign direct investment. Terminology that the economists who collect this data use is inward FDI stock and outward FDI stock, and I just plotted the most recent United Nations data on this for the European Union's Western states. As you can see, if you are on that black diagonal line, that means you have exactly as much outgoing as incoming foreign capital. Now the empirical patterns show that there's only one West European state that did not cross that line to the right and the bottom of it, and that during the period of the 1990s and 2000s, and that is Portugal. Even Ireland, no, I'm not actually sure who that green line is. Maybe it's Spain, I'm not sure, has ended up crossing it. So basically, basically what it is that the West European states are both receivers and exporters of capital, but much more, or somewhat more exporters than importers of it. And this is basically what the European integration was supposed to be about anyway, right? This is one of the key precepts of the EU. Now, here is Eastern Europe for you. I'll just pause for a moment for you to take it in. This is the 90s and the 2000s in terms of the balance of foreign direct investment, which means that there is not a single East Central European Union member state that has, well, there's only one here, I think that may have been Romania actually, which at the beginning of the period was more or less exactly on that line, but other than that, all of them have been to the left and above it, meaning that they are dependent, and most of them by the end of the middle to end of the period, very, very significantly, heavily dependent on foreign direct investment. In other words, to repeat the political economy of all this, these are states whose labor, domestic labor, produces value for capital that is located in outside these countries, and we know it from other sources that that happens, of course, to be very predominantly the Western states of the European Union. Now, a second institution that brings together West European big capital and East European labor is, of course, the physical movement of people from Eastern Europe to the societies of Western Europe to perform labor. This is the exact same in terms of political economy as foreign direct investment, only this applies to jobs that cannot be performed outside of Western Europe. What are the jobs? There's a great variety of them, from construction to personal services such as healthcare and sex work, and a number of things, nice and not so nice, in between. This is just a summary graph for the foreign direct investment for each group of states. Anyway. So the next one is something I'm going to call displacement of labor. By the way, there is even a terminological struggle politically because some of these labor-emitting states of Eastern Europe demand not to have the right not to even refer to their outgoing workers as migrants. So, for instance, the Hungarian Prime Minister during the recent visit of the British Prime Minister demanded that Cameron accept the fact that these are not migrants but Europeans. I love that. Anyway, so without further ado, I just plotted basically first the degree of dependence of these societies on unemployment abroad. The dotted line at the bottom, the black line, is the world average, meaning that roughly about 3% of the world's societies lives abroad and earns income abroad. Our region is all the colored lines, pretty much all of them by the period have reached high or extremely high levels. About half of the cases have more than 10% of their domestic labor force working abroad right now. This is not directly my point, but I also plotted those states that are not members of the European Union, but former socialist states. These are the successor states of the Soviet Union. They too are extremely highly dependent. The graph is almost identical. It's just that their typical out-migration is not to the European Union primarily, but to either Russia or Ukraine or Kazakhstan in the last 25 years. Anyway, more relevant is the number of proportion among their outgoing labor who are in Western Europe. And now this is absolutely astonishing as far as I'm concerned. So basically what you have is the release of a fairly gigantic proportion of the domestic labor which happened because of the end of the state socialist period and the end of the jobs. As you know, more than in the case of Hungary, more than 1 million jobs have been destroyed in this process. The alleviation of that situation happens by way of the migration of people for jobs in Western Europe. This, by the way, takes a particular time pattern because although they did all of them join the European Union in 2004, but as you will remember, most of the member states of the European Union prohibited East European labor immigration for an additional 7 years, with the exception of the 25 number correctly, and Sweden for medical personnel. I think that may have been it. I may be rusty on that. Anyway, these are states that whose let's just say social peace in terms of relatively low levels of unemployment in the domestic economy depends to a very large extent on their ability to release their excess labor to the European Union. And finally, not just in terms of the physical presence of people out of the country so that they don't cause trouble, but also these states are very significantly dependent on the remittances, that there is the money that is being sent back by their labor to the domestic economy. So much so, this plot is the horizontal axis is income, so per capita GDP, and the vertical one is the percent of GDP that is from migrant remittances. This is from an earlier paper of mine, so the format is somewhat different, but I hope you notice that all the triangles, which in this case represent the states, EU member states, actually there may have been others here, but the former socialist states of Eastern Europe, they're all on the top perimeter of that distribution. In other words, in their income category, they are at the top in terms of their dependence on remittances from abroad. So, to conclude, when the let's just say somewhat perhaps overly sanguine right-wing Prime Minister and his government of Hungary create this slightly absurd rhetoric of anti-immigrant, anti-asylum, anti-human rights, racist and specifically cultural racist rhetorics, policies and measures. What they are doing it in front of is a background condition under which they are fully, and I should also say in terms of the histories of these societies, in an unprecedented degree dependent on outside forces, specifically the European Union. So whom they're fighting are potential competitors in not only just the domestic labor market, but also the West European labor market. This, of course, is completely missing from the criticisms of the government's actions. So to conclude, I wanted to show a little sign of sort of optimism, just so that we have something to take away from all this. This is one of the famous posters that the government created. This very pretty girl is supposedly saying, "We know illegal immigrants, and their uniforms are working." This is a government billboard that Hungary was covered with in the early part of 2015. Very cute white girl with blue eyes, if you notice, blonde and everything. But this whole campaign was immediately followed in the social media space by a series of memes, a series of jokes on that. So here is a version of that. All plates are clean in London already. This was one of those things that people created. And that same girl is saying that. And it makes a lot of sense because it's exactly girls of this age who are doing most of the plates cleaning in London right now. And here is another one where there was a whole series of government posters that said, if you come to Hungary, for instance, you have to respect our laws and so on. And then so this one was appeared on the internet. If you come to Hungary, if you go to Hungary, swing by my place. I need to send this a package to my mother. Okay, so that more or less concludes my presentation. Thank you.
I'd like to thank first of all Attila Melegh for inviting me to this conference. Look forward to the other talks. And what I want to do today is to try to present a series of reflections of thoughts that are going on now in my head. So they will not necessarily be fully fledged. I look forward to your comments. What I would like to do is begin with a problem. And it's a problem that I think has not received much attention because it has been clouded by a series of commonsensical views about migration. And the problem for me is why has, in this recent crisis, have migrants been so radically excluded? What I mean by radical exclusion is not simply the political or economic exclusion of migrants or refugees. I will use the term randomly, I will not explain why in a moment. But what is the nature of this radical exclusion? And I think this radical exclusion has two aspects. The first is the construction of a category migrant that privileges an opposite category, which is Europe or European. This category of Europe or European is then bestowed with a specific idea of order. And it's important because it becomes not simply a historical spatial account of order as a particular way of organizing social space, but an account of order itself against an account of migrants and migration as embodying lack. So on the one side you have a fullness, a capacity, an entire world, totality. On the other side you have lack. This construction of migration is transformative, it is generative. It creates a European subjectivity, something to be valorized, something to which we are familiar, and something for which we must defend. There is then, of course, a displacement of violence. Yes? The violence that is being talked about increasingly, including by the Hungarian Prime Minister, is not a violence that migrants have experienced over the last year or so, but a violence that Europe is threatened with. A violence to order caused by intrusions of migrants. So you have, in this construction of migration, in this construction of the radically excluded other, you have this first aspect, an imaginative geography, an imaginary geography, I'm sorry, which establishes Europe as a space of order against a space of lack. The second thing that happens, and it follows, and is concomitant and it's obvious, I think, and that's a foreclosing of the possibility of the agency of migrants. What do I mean by that? When you have, on the one hand, fullness, on the other side you have lack, what you end up with is removing the grounds from which migrants can speak, except as migrants. And this is problematic, except as excluded groups of people alien to the European norm. This is troubling for various reasons, but I want to pick up on these two ideas, and I want to try to say that a combination of Marx's labor theory of value and Frantz Fanon's account of the racialized value allows us to approach the problem of migration in relation to the problem of the project of Europe. How the project of Europe is constructed, and we know it is constructed through the articulation and naming of different others. But the very way I said it the construction of others, establishes dichotomies. There is a Europe and there is an otherness. What I'm interested in is thinking about migrants not as migrants, but as groups of people who are commonly marginalized by the way in which global capitalism works. Commonly marginalized, what I mean is that migrants are in relation to the structure of capitalism, which is similar to the way in which certain indigenous others in Europe are related to the structure of capitalism. Roma, for example, in this part of the world. So what I want to do, and I've basically preempted myself, I've told you what I want to say, but I'll expand on it a little bit as I speak. What I want to do is to talk about Europe's colonial present. This is not an account of post-colonial Europe, it's an account of the colonial present of Europe. It's not an account of the territorial histories of colonialism, it's an account of how colonial modes of rule, this, what I said in the beginning, this foreclosing of the possibility of agency of the other, which was central to the European project of colonialism, persists. And I think a combination of Fanon and Marx, and this is where I would like your input, because it's very much something that's percolating in my mind, and your critique would be useful. Some combination of Marx's theory of labor value and Fanon's idea of the racialized colony will, I think, be important in trying to understand how migrants are both radically excluded from a European society and also tethered to it in Fanon's terms, not simply related, but connected to it as the shadowy underbelly of European society. I will do so, I will examine this first of all by speaking of what Viktor Orbán has recently termed the Hungarian solution to the problem of migration in Europe. And I will go on to speak about the imaginary geographies that are present in this Hungarian solution, and also in how the EU has adopted some aspects of this Hungarian solution, following Edward Said. Then I will talk about the problem of surplus populations, and this is where I think we begin to see the connections between migrants and indigenous others in Europe. We begin to see how state and capital work together in order to establish certain, I would say in short form, hegemonic norms of belonging against others. And then I will turn to Fanon and Marx to try and illustrate this a little bit better. And I want to end, hopefully on a not too despairing note, by talking about how this perspective can actually point to and strengthen existing solidarities between migrants and citizens. I apologize for this, my printer stopped working, so I just need to use this. I apologize for that. 2 weeks ago in February, after a meeting, an EU Heads of State Summit in Brussels, Viktor Orbán spoke of a Hungarian solution. I just want to read a little bit about this, and this is my translation of Hungarian speech. So it's a translation in process. It's correct, but it's a translation in process. So Orbán said this in a press conference. It's not actually a speech, but a press conference in which he picked up on aspects of his speech. And Orbán said, 2015 was a difficult year for Europe, I would add, particularly for Hungary. In a magnitude of millions, without controls, unidentifiable and unknown masses of people appeared in Hungary and at the European Union's southern border. Now, for the first time, the European Union has accepted the Hungarian solution. We have prioritized border protection and the stopping of the migrant masses. We have to stop them. Our external borders must be protected and the Schengen Accord must be upheld 100% by everyone. The Balkan route countries and Austria have finally taken the path of common sense. What these countries are doing is in reality the Hungarian solution. They have built fences, even if they don't call them fences. They have stopped migrants and they have returned migrants. This was always the Hungarian stand. There are two things here which are particularly interesting. First are the imaginative geographies at work. There is something named a Balkan route. Geographies are productive. So suddenly there's something called the Balkan route. It's become the norm now. We all discovered it sometime over the summer last year. There's a Balkan route stretching to, well, now Macedonia, Serbia, Slovenia, Austria. And there is an imagination of Europe and the possibility of border. There are two types of geographies being recognized. One is an alien intrusion into Europe. The Balkan route is an alien intrusion into Europe that needs to be, well, that needs to be closed. It's an alien intrusion into Europe because, and remember Orban, I don't know whether you caught it, I didn't have a slide, because Orban juxtaposes the disorderly mobility of migrants against Schengen. We need to uphold Schengen. There is a valorized and desirable account of mobility against an alien account of mobility. There are also accounts of a faceless mass. There is a geography where the Balkan route is alien, it's populated, not by orderly people, but it is a chaos against which the order of Schengen is constructed as desired. So here you have the dual juxtaposition. Migrants as a disorderly alien intrusion to Europe via the Balkan route, and Schengen, something to be upheld, something to be salvaged, and the representation of truly orderly mobility. I will get to Schengen in a little bit, just briefly. But Schengen, of course, is not a deregulation of mobility, it's a regulation of capitalist mobilities. And against this we have a disorderly and excess mobility. I will say later, and this is important for the connection with Fanon and Marx, is that this disorderly mobility exists because the orderly mobility of capitalist movement within Schengen conceals a shadowy underbelly. A whole range of informal economies that have long attracted migrants to Europe. So the Attila, and I'll get to another one. The Hungarian solution which Orban talks about is an attempt then, first of all, generated of two different spaces, a space of order and a space of disorder, creating then a space of Europe to be valorized and a space of otherness. And I want to follow Edward Said on this. Edward Said, when he talks about imaginary geographies, writes, a group of people living on a few acres of land will set up boundaries between their land and its immediate surroundings. Greeks and the territory beyond, which they call the land of the barbarians. In other words, this familiar practice of designating in one's mind a familiar space which is ours and an unfamiliar space beyond ours which is theirs is a way of making geographical distinctions that can be entirely arbitrary. Because the imaginative geography of the our land, barbarian land, variety does not require that the barbarians acknowledge the distinction. This last part is important. What I'm trying to convey is that the European response to migration creates, in the first place, generates a valorized space of Europe, a space under threat. Remember, Orban started his speech by saying 2015 was a difficult year for Europe, which is a remarkable, short-sighted, but of course politically calculative statement. It was not a difficult year for millions of migrants. It was a difficult year for Europe. The imaginative geography creates a space which is familiar, a space of value, against another space. And it's a hugely colonial act, because colonialism, fundamentally of the 19th century, was based on a sense of the capacity and validity of European readings of other spaces, of giving these spaces a name that exists in counterpoint to Europe. So you have then the imagination of fullness within Europe and a lack in the colony. Here, an imagination of the fullness of the Schengen structure of mobility and the lack, the chaos of migration and the alien intrusions of this imagined thing called the Balkan route. Yes. When Said says that the barbarian does not need to acknowledge the distinction, that's telling. The migrant does not need to acknowledge the distinction. The migrant does not need to acknowledge his or her distinction as a legal migrant, as refugee, or as migrant. It is an imposition from a different perspective, from imposition from Europe. This is a foreclosing of the possibility of agency. The European colonial present and the colonial past centered on its capacity and validity of naming other spaces. Well, if you have the capacity to name other spaces, you impose a certain narrative of speech and the political, on the other. You foreclose the possibility of other agents. I just been told I need to end, but I will continue just for another 4 minutes. And I'll try and wrap it up. I haven't got a clock, I haven't kept track of time. What I want to talk about now is capitalism and and the production of surplus. And I do this briefly through Marx's labor theory of value. Marx's labor theory of value had one important aspect, which is that labor itself doesn't simply produce value in terms of surplus, but it contributes and adds to a social register of valuation. What this implies is there are particular modes of laboring, particular modes of work, which are privileged over others. Again, it establishes a point and a counterpoint, non-productive form of labor against forms of work which are demeaning, which are thought to be demeaning or unproductive, and so on. This is again central to the colonial past and the colonial present. The identification, central also to neoliberalism, which I won't get into now because it involves more other sort of thinking, of welfare scroungers, of people at the edges of society. This account of labor, it's producing a specific register of value, points also to surplus populations, by which I think Marx meant the generation or the naming of groups of people who had a non-productive, thought to have a non-productive role in society. This is relational, and it brings, I won't get into it now, we can talk about it, it's interesting. What Fanon does at this point is that he makes an interesting entry point. These social registers of value, the social register of value which labor helps to sustain through work and production, is racially tinged. It's obvious. Stuart Hall has picked up on this. But the point that Fanon makes here, and the point that I want to try and bring together, is that, so I'm trying to rush, I forget what I want to say. Sorry? Is the point that Fanon wants to make is that these regimes of valuation are racialized. Yes? So there are groups of people who are excluded from a regime of value that privileges a specific civilizational concept of labor and so on. The civilizational concept of labor, of what constitutes productive labor, excludes, differentiates and excludes the other forms of work, other forms of labor. At this point, what we see is a Europe, and I'm ending now, is a Europe which is not centered on the project of Europe, which is not centered on order, on peace, on economic liberalism, but on the cultivation of excluded others whose exclusion is central to the establishment of the validity of a specific capitalist form. At this point, and I'm being very short, at this point we're able to talk, to hear the voice of migrants, not as migrants, not as refugees, not as illegal migrants, but as groups of people experiencing a common marginalization because of structures of racialized capitalism. And at this point, we move away from dichotomies, move away from the category migration, but I think that we're able to understand better migration in these days.
You for the organizers for having me here. The case with my presentation is just a bit like this Iván Szelényi's non-presentation. The organizers talked me into talking about something which is only very partially my field. So what I'm trying to do, or what I will be doing, is my presentation has three parts. I first walk you in a kind of a tour de force through some of the history of globalizing gender policies or gender imperialism. I will then talk very briefly about the co-construction of the global co-construction of gender traditionalism as ensuing phenomena or dynamics. And then in the third part, I will talk about what all of that, how all of that can help you to think differently and act differently in relation to what is labeled the refugee crisis. So today, anti-refugee discourse and policies systematically builds on the invocation of Western gender norms. And quite many of the pro-refugee activists would not be hesitant to identify with these same norms and values. The point of departure of my contribution today is that looking at the history of the entanglement between globalizing gender politics on the one hand and global inequality on the other can serve as a conceptual foundation for developing an alternative perspective on this present condition of mounting racism and mounting polarization. For this reason, I focus in particular on developing argumentative strategies which can help us to challenge both dominant forms of the appropriation of reference to women's rights or women's equality and the varieties of opposition and rejection of these same values. Let me start my outline of the historical trajectories of globalizing gender politics with a vignette exemplifying British treaty-making with non-sovereign entities in the middle of the 19th century. In this period, commanders of the British Royal Navy, at this time the world's uncontested leading maritime power, and other British authorities concluded dozens of treaties with dozens of chiefs and kings reigning territories at the African coastside. And the quality of the present PowerPoint will be better after this slide. The suppression of the slave trade, described as a dictate of humanity in these treaties, at the time was the most significant humanitarian goal the British pursued internationally, and if need be, with military means. At the same time, in quite a number of cases, other humanitarian causes, including gender-related ones, made it into the treaties and/or the related discourse. Among them were norms such as those condemning polygamy and, as in the example displayed here, the commitment, quote, to do away with the abominable, inhuman and unchristian-like custom of sacrificing human lives on the account of the superstitious practices of one African community. Reference to gender norms thus formed an inherent part of the globalizing humanitarian policies unfolding at the time. These globalizing gender and humanitarian policies were characterized by two fundamental traits. First, they combined their universalizing argument about the global reach and the non-negotiability of certain norms as rooted in the dictate of humanity, with systematic reference to the Western origin of these same norms and values. These values were said to be rooted in Christianity or, later on, in the standards of the family of nations or the international community. Second, globalizing gender policies decontextualized these same norms and standards so that each of them could serve as a non-negotiable point of reference for trans-border single-issue policies. As a result, such globalizing gender policies were considered legitimate in whatever framework they were pursued otherwise, that is, including global power policies, colonial and imperial policies, military intervention, etc. This dynamic played out on many levels. Importantly, international European interaction with non-Western powers was predicated on the commitment of these powers to an evolving standard of civilization in international law. As Gary Gong has argued, this standard of civilization as a malleable legal configuration, so it was a legal configuration, it involved as its most elastic and most subjective element the demand that a country accepted certain civilized norms before it was considered to conform to the accepted norms and practices of the civilized international society, including, in these early days, the condemnation of sati, widow burning, and polygamy as the core of the emerging globalizing gender policies. Similar dynamics play out in the European interaction with non-Western, non-sovereigns in the international system and in the framework of broader global reform and gender discourses as well as colonial policies. After 1810 in Great Britain, driven by Christian missionaries and the humanitarian movement, a strong campaign against sati, that is widow burning or widow sacrifice in India, unfolded. Its proponents argued that Britain had a duty to bring civilization to her Indian subjects, focusing in particular on the ill treatment of women. The argument was once again built up as a single issue type of argument, and it was once again cast in non-negotiable humanitarian terms, that is, reference to suffering humanity and suffering women formed a key point of departure. In addition, the argument was focused on addressing powerful men who exercised colonial authority, demanding that they act on behalf of suffering women. The anti-sati campaign in this way legitimized imperial power in the name of both humanity and Western civilization and gender norms on the one hand, and saving suffering non-Western women on the other. A first milestone towards the full abolition of sati in British India was accomplished in 1829. Western feminism, so far I didn't talk about feminism, but Western feminism didn't escape this logic of globalizing gender policies either. As Claire Midgley has persuasively argued, already the earliest proto-feminist tracts from the late 18th century onward built in the most explicit manner on the identification of appropriate gender relations and progress in terms of women's status with Christian and Western civilization, and the parallel identification of non-Western societies as despotic or corrupt entities, keeping women in the status of abject subordination. In doing so, these feminist tracts construed women's subordination within Western civilization, which, so they did admit, still existed as an anomaly or as an anachronistic reminder of the uncivilized past of Western civilization itself. Women's subordination was, in other words, construed as un-Western, and women's emancipation as modern and Western in character. This allowed, within the various frameworks of unequal global interaction and unequal interaction between dominant and dominated populations, to both construct adherence to women's equality as positive identification with Western values, and to justify policies of global domination via reference to women's equality. This early history and ongoing constellation had dramatic consequences for the fate of women's emancipation in both dominated and dominant world regions, amongst dominated and dominant populations globally, including in terms of how first world white societies have related to brown immigration and brown refugees. I will discuss some of these consequences in a few minutes. The 20th and 21st centuries can be considered as a period in which these globalizing gender policies have been transformed into one important element of more modern forms of global governance, which on the surface has appeared less imperial than their 19th century predecessors. However, even a cursory glance into the history of gendered global governance reveals that this historical process is better characterized as a transformation of imperialism and a partial deterritorialization, and thus even an expansion of imperialism. In the aftermath of the First World War, earlier beginnings of internationalization were transformed into international organization embodied by the League of Nations. Those gender values inherited from the 19th century, which were deemed universal and had formerly been associated with the West, now increasingly came to be associated with the international community as such. This international community uniformly called upon all countries to conform to certain standards of acceptable behavior. In the process of decolonization, for the emerging Third World members of the international community, advancement to sovereignty was granted with reference to these standards. During the short 20th century, the international community assumed at least soft authority in terms of monitoring compliance with or approximation of these standards. After the end of the Cold War, with the Soviet Union as rival power in the global South disappearing, this soft authority increasingly transformed back into humanitarian and military intervention. Unequally globalizing gender policies took on important additional traits within these new unfolding forms of global governance. First, international organizations claimed international rather than imperial authority to interfere with gender relations on the ground and promote women's human rights in many parts of the world. This international authority was not without imperial bias. One example, analyzed by Keith Wallenberg among others, was the response of the League of Nations, founded in 1919, to women and children survivors of the Armenian genocide. During and after the end of World War I, Armenian women and children on large scale were sequestered, forcefully adopted or enslaved into Muslim households, subjected to forced conversion or marriage, etc. The ensuing international rescue operation, concerted by the League and feminist activists working in its orbit, focused on the fate of these women, emphatically identifying these women as Christian women in Muslim society in the dissolving Ottoman Empire. The truly international humanitarian intervention thus addressed a weak non-Western power and its dominant population, which was deemed unable or unwilling to address the problem. The intervention thoroughly, once again, decontextualized the problem, built on universalized humanitarian values, and justified intervention with reference to the fate of Christian rather than Muslim women. I skip here other examples in which the focus was on rescuing non-Western and non-Christian women, and to how, from the 1930s onwards, expanding global governance and international authority came to, from above, promote the emancipation of women everywhere in the world via enshrining instruments aimed at ensuring gender equality and women's rights into a whole bunch of international conventions and international law. I also don't discuss how gender has been implicated in the post-Cold War policies of renewed cross-border interventions. Imperial policies of globalizing Western gender norms, and this is my second, much shorter part, historically have played an important role not only in terms of indeed modernizing non-Western gender regimes, but also in terms of creating, expanding and ossifying gender traditionalism, as it is called. Two related dynamics are of key interest here. First, as imperial and Western discourse and policies engaged in a sustained manner with non-Western societies' gender practices deemed inhuman, they themselves contributed to the reification and culturalization of these practices. Intense Western and colonial, discursive and political engagement with these inhuman practices inevitably publicized these practices and contributed to making them more prominent. As Jörg Fischer has argued for the case of Sati in India, the British now construed the practice as religious, since this move allowed them to refrain from whole-scale aggressive interference. Deeming Sati as belonging to religious and then private law, as it was now codified, the British aimed to not unnecessarily antagonize male colonial elites. Whatever the precise combination of these and other factors, taken together, they contributed to the legal and cultural reification of what was now considered un-Western gender norms and practices. Second, globalizing gender policies provoked outright opposition within the Global South against imperial interference into gender regimes in non-Western settings. From the start, much of this opposition was imprisoned in the very rhetoric created by globalizing gender politics itself, namely the language of universal values and cultural or religious essentialism. Already in 1830, for example, Indian notables, in a petition against the abolition of sati by the British, argued that the invocation of, quote, the common voice of humanity as a justification for abolition equals an unjustified ascendance of a low and vague standard over the sacred prescriptions of our religion, end quote. Opposition against globalizing gender policies was informed by quite a number of divergent interests, and it could be outspoken or silent about these respective interests. In the case of the international rescue operation for Armenian women and children in the early 1920s, to which I referred earlier, for example, both male representatives of the Muslim elite and Turkish feminists defended the practice of abducting Armenian women or enforced assimilation of these women. The former, the male Muslim elites, cast the practice as one giving shelter to helpless women and children who would have lacked any protection otherwise, whereas one Turkish feminist defended the same practice as, quote, an attempt to erase national difference in a moment of extreme threat to the Turkish nation. As globalizing gender policies incorporated additional agendas in the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, opposition against these policies followed suit in terms of incorporating these same agendas into its strategies. The related ongoing unequal exchanges have proved extremely harmful to gender emancipation worldwide. The policies of promoting LGBT rights, for example, worldwide, are one example. Reporting at length on current Western sexual imperialism, a recent issue of the English language online journal Dabik, which has been associated with the ISIS, describes how Western countries use, quote, their shirk-based parliaments to legalize sodomite marriage and their education system to corrupt their children right from the kindergarten level by introducing books into the curriculum to combat homophobia. Dabik continues, in the midst of this widespread affront on natural human disposition, the Islamic State continues its efforts against these deeds of misguidance, which Western civilizations regard as part of their values by implementing the rulings of Allah on those who practice any form of sexual deviancy or transgression. Gender and neoliberalism arrived as a package in Eastern Europe, had awkward consequences for the prospects of progressive gender policies in Eastern Europe. The packaging, for instance, nourished leftist groups' suspicion that gender studies was something liberal rather than leftist, and that women's movements had been something Western all the way along. I skip one other example here. In sum, the imperialism of globalizing gender policies has contributed in many ways to both the reification and culturalization of traditional gender regimes, and it has allowed patriarchal interest to construct its patriarchalism as anti-imperialist. So far in this paper, I have tried to hint at some important long-term trends in the relationship between globalizing gender policies and imperialisms on the one hand, and unequal global interaction on the other. I have also described how over time this gender agenda has taken on additional issues and developed into a full-scale global gender regime, and how its geopolitics have transmuted from classical imperialism to global governance and its present retransformations in more clearly visible imperialisms. Finally, I have discussed the implication of gender imperialism in the development of traditionalist and reactionary gender regimes and discourses. This allows for two intermediate analytical conclusions aimed at helping us to make sense of the present global condition, including the gender dimensions of the current so-called refugee crisis in Europe. First, the gender traditionalism of non-Western societies or religions, insofar as there is any, has long been and continues to be, among other things, a byproduct of the unequal interaction between Western global expansionism and non-Western civilizations. It is, in other words, co-produced by this interaction, since unequal global interaction has contributed to construct non-Western societies as being built on un-Western legal orders, and it has contributed to making sections of non-Western societies insist on and even invent traditional gender orders. Such traditionalism, thus, cannot be characterized as an inherent or autochtone characteristic of these societies. Phenomena such as non-Western anti-feminism, resistance to LGBT emancipation, etc., have been co-produced by the ongoing unequal globalization of gender policies. This, of course, doesn't make any of these phenomena any better or any more acceptable. Yet, without systematically sinking this connection into our critique of these phenomena, we get involved, even if we consider ourselves, among other things, anti-imperialists, into the very pro-imperialist discourse dominating the related global gender struggle. I will return to this set of problems when I talk about the refugee crisis as such. Second, the development promoted by the West, the family of nations, and today the international community, from anti-Sati rhetoric in the 19th century through the rhetoric of gender equality in the 20th century to the rhetoric of gender studies and LGBT emancipation, etc. in the 21st, has been co-motivated and co-produced from the moment of its origin to the present day by imperialist interest and involvement. In other words, without this imperialist connection, the triumph of gender rights and gender equality as dominant discourses, while of course not realities, in the Western world might not have been even possible. For sure, the systematic appropriation of some of the claims of women's and now also LGBT movements by dominant Western-led global policies has been predicated on this imperialist connection. Feminism, insofar as it construed itself as being a part of Western civilization, partook in this dynamic from the very beginning. In this sense, it is, in both political and scholarly terms, inappropriate to consider and talk about gender equality, etc., as our Western values, since these values have always signified global hegemonic policies and the politics of global inequality. Whenever we construct these same values as our values or our Western values, or for that matter our anti-urban values, we acquiesce in these ongoing politics of global inequality. Again, I will return to this in a moment. Within the context of the present refugee crisis, the tensions and confrontations rooted in this false we and them dichotomy are playing out in ever new intensity within Europe itself. The implications integration of gender ideology in the confrontation between white and brown populations within the global north, of course, historically is nothing new. Yet especially after the events in Cologne, in the night of New Year's Eve, at least in the German-speaking world, we have seen a particularly horrible acceleration and aggravation of gender imperialism within Europe. This landslide has many facets. Measures such as a temporary ban on male asylum seekers from a municipal swimming pool after one incident of sexual attack committed by an asylum seeker in the facility are widely reported in the media and have become widely accepted. The discourse of how do we react to sexual atrocities committed by them and how do we protect our gender values and gender culture against such atrocities has come to dominate German TV talk shows and channels, while concomitantly any alternative political discourse which raise questions as to the very discursive foundations of such a discourse as summarized above has effectively disappeared from public sight. The discourse of differential legal treatment, that is, differential beyond what we have long known anyway, for asylum seekers or other resident non-citizens, as well as more recently naturalized citizens in case they violate our gender norms, has become fully socially acceptable, making gender into one of the categories invoked in the systematic erosion of the rights and normative legal guarantees which once came with citizenship and refugee status. Justified by reference to our gender norms, we witnessed, in other words, the erosion of fundamental legal guarantees and categories within Europe as such. Intense efforts are underway in terms of compulsory education, and that's the slide you have here, of young male refugees into our gender culture, whereby, as a side effect, miniskirt and high heels as characteristics of our gender culture are normalized more than ever before, while sexual violence committed by our men remains as closeted as it ever was. Meanwhile, Austrian media report a dramatic increase of the applications for firearm licenses and the sharp increase of the trade volume in self-defense devices as such. Gendered sexual violence committed by them against their women is discussed or presented only if such discussion serves the policies of our domination and their exclusion. Meanwhile, critical white feminists, while confident in pointing out that the ongoing sexual violence our men commit against our women should be equally addressed, seem to be paralyzed when it comes to developing solidarity with brown women who have experienced sexual violence committed by brown men, for obvious reasons. If these feminists in this condition talk about brown men's sexual misbehavior, their discourse is as easily as effectively appropriated by the mainstream anti-refugee discourse, insisting on the aggressive imposition of our gender norms on them. In parallel, I have not heard so far, but maybe it's out there somewhere, about white feminists speaking out explicitly as regards the question whether there is sexual violence committed by white men against female asylum seekers. Similarly, it does not seem to be possible any longer to even raise or discuss the question as to the relationship between the particularly hopeless legal status and asylum prospects of certain groups of non-citizens, that is, the relationship between the wider context of the single issue of sexual molestation and the reportedly high crime rates amongst these groups. Any discussion of this issue seems to be effectively silenced through the equation between reference to the connection and thus to the relevance of class and citizenship status for any informed debate about crime, on the one hand, and seeking excuse for some brown men's violation of our gender norm or relativizing their criminal behavior on the other. The critique of the extremely marginalized class and citizenship status of many brown men is thus effectively silenced, and the discussion of material groundings of crime is apparently impossible. What does all of this imply for any left-wing, anti-imperialist and pro-women and pro-LGBT liberation-based critique of recurrent gender imperialism as framing the discourse and politics over the refugee crisis in Europe? How can we, in other words, building on the findings of the historical global analysis outlined above, develop a left-wing, anti-imperialist and pro-women and pro-LGBT liberation-based critique of the present condition of invoking gender in relation to the refugee crisis in Europe? I think 4 important points can be made here. First, opposition against imperial or globalizing gender policies must go beyond the critique of the instrumentalization of gender equality and progressive gender norms for a gender imperialism argument. The argumentative figure of instrumentalization in substance doesn't leave any space for pursuing progressive gender policies, because it tends to conflate progressive gender policies with imperialism, and because it tends to conceptually and politically privilege the anti-imperialist element of resisting gender imperialism over adherence to progressive gender policies. Second, insisting on, and this is an initiative which is out there in Germany, second, insisting on against sexualized violence and racism always, anywhere, is good, yet also not enough. Related politics always and anywhere must make explicit, and this is really important, they must make explicit their anti-imperial grounding, since otherwise such universal politics will be appropriated by dominant globalizing gender discourses and subjected to their divisive dynamics and strategies. In addition, dominated groups, and women belonging to dominated groups in particular, will not trust such alternative global discourses focusing simply on equality or gender equality everywhere. Third, gender policies must take on a much more inclusive character. They must resist the separation, the singling out of progressive gender norms and policies from larger processes of social, material and cultural transformation, since such singling out has long been one condition sine qua non of the imperial globalization of gender policies. The anti-imperialist element and anti-imperial element of resisting gender imperialism must form one of several elements, none of them conceptually or politically privileged of such inclusive gender policies. Fourth, and to state the obvious, the voices of brown women must take center stage in the fight against sexualized violence and other forms of gender oppression in the present refugee crisis. Since these women live at the intersection between brown, hierarchical gender orders, feminism dominated by white women, and white, patriarchal and imperial interest. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm afraid, you know, I was a very bad chair, could not control it. Myself was talking too long, so we are over time. We can have only a 5-minute break. We really don't have time for discussion.
And everybody should...
A bit unorthodox.